Okay. So this morning we're going to begin the second part of Moed Katan, which doesn't really divide up exactly by lines of text, because in the middle of the discussion of Chol HaMoed, we begin to discuss another Moed, which is the Aveilut. This morning we're going to do a little less focus on the Gemara, less than I like to do, because this is really a Gemara shir, but you can't avoid this morning to start off the Aveilut part of it. So we'll begin. The Gemara on Daf, this first text on the Yudal or Bet, has a whole litany of Minhagei Aveilut that relate to Chol HaMoed. And as an introduction to that, the Gemara begins by saying, an Avel eino noheg aviluto beregel, shene'emar v'samachta b'chagecha. So it begins as follows, that an Avel doesn't celebrate his Aveilut or commemorate, right? Doesn't practice his Aveilut on the holiday, because it says v'samachta b'chagecha, right? We saw this, if you remember, v'samachta b'chagecha v'lo b'ishtecha, right? With you can't get married on the regel. So one of those things that an Avel can't do that. At first glance, if we just had that statement, we would say that an Avel just basically it suspends the Aveilut. It doesn't stop it or it doesn't not start it. But the Gemara then continues and says, I Aveilut mi'i karahu. If the morning had already begun, meaning you started your morning a couple of days before, then the Gemara says, Ati asei de rabim v'dachi asei de yachid. The positive commandment of v'samachta b'chagecha will stop in its tracks the obligation that you have to be Avel, and because of that, you won't have to basically continue sitting Aveilut. And if someone died on Chol HaMoed, lo ati asei de yachid v'dachi asei de rabim. In other words, your initial obligation to sit and be an Avel, that won't kick in. Basically, in other words, you can do the Kvura, but you won't be an Avel because you have the obligation, the communal obligation of Samachta b'chagecha that will preclude the onset of Aveilut. So Aveilut, just halacha l'maaseh, as we know, if you started sitting Shiva even for a few minutes, so then the regel stops it. And if you even Shavuos, right, it counts 7 days. And alternatively, if you didn't start, if someone died, like Rabbi Soloveitchik died during Pesach, so the family has to go through 3, 4, 5 days of purgatory, so to speak, and then start the Aveilut at the end of the Chag. We'll talk about when exactly they start in a few minutes. What makes this statement of the Gemara so dramatic is, of course, the statement of the Aseh, the Yachid, because one must wonder when one reads this Gemara, what Aseh exactly are we talking about? Where is the obligation to sit, to have Aveilut at all? Right? I don't know if you ever thought about it, but it doesn't say in the Torah, you must sit in Avel. The only, indications we have, there is a time when there is such a thing called aninut, which might be biblical or not. I want to try to avoid that discussion as much as possible today. Whether the period before the burial is obligatory to not drink wine, to not eat meat, to learn Torah, that might be biblical in character, because we have an example of that when Aaron's sons die, and then God tells Moshe, go tell him, continue in the offerings, etc., because you're not a regular onain, etc. Vayidom Aaron, that might be biblical. But where in the Bible could we possibly have an obligation to observe the commandments of Aveilut, or the customs of Aveilut, especially if we know that one of the sources we'll get to in a few minutes, we know halacha kedivrei mekel ba'avel. Right? We know that when it comes to Aveilut, I always tell this to people, right when I meet them the first time, when the first time they're sitting Aveilut, I say, you should know, we always go like a lenient opinion. And of course, if it was a biblical commandment, so then we would have responsibility to treat it much more seriously. So again, the question becomes, what is our Gemara talking about? If our Gemara, so there is a whole set of sources. I'll just line out what I want to try to do. I want to talk about the sources that talk about Aveilut being Doraita. I want to talk about this, the Rishonim, the Machloket Rishonim, whether it's Doraita or Rabbanon. I want to talk about two different types of Aveilut, one that might be Doraita and one that might be Rabbanon. And then I want to talk about particularly what people are going to do with our Gemara. In other words, I do want to focus on our Gemara. If you don't believe that Aveilut is Doraita, so then what are you going to do? right? How are you going to read our Gemara? And there's all sorts of really far-fetched readings of our Gemara that will, try to bring it in line with the fact that Aveilut is not Doraita. Just to put it out there at the beginning, I have nothing to hide. There's three opinions about Aveilut. There's one opinion that says all 7 days is Doraita. There's one opinion that says 1 day is Doraita. That splits into two. The 1 day Doraita theme can be the day of Kvura and the day of Mitan, so they have to happen simultaneously, in other words, on the same day. If the burial and the death and the burial happen, which happens more in Israel than in overseas, if that happens on the same day, there's some people say it's Doraita. Some people say the Aveilut is Doraita, even if the death and the burial don't happen on the same day. And then there's a third opinion that says everything's Derabanan. That's Rabbeinu Tam and the Reed, the Tosafos. And it really breaks down, it almost easily breaks down into Sephardi Ashkenazi, that the Sephardim all hold, the whole Chachmei Sfarad are going to hold that somehow it's biblical, whether the 7 days or primarily the 1 day, again, with the split, 1 day burial and death the same day or not. And the Ashkenazim, the Tosafos, are basically going to all say it's all Derabanan. Okay? So, but I'm not playing my cards yet because I'm not telling you the fun stuff, the lumdus, etc. So let's start off with what can we do to bolster the simple reading of our Gemara that there is an Aseh Yachid, which gets canceled by the Aseh Rabbim. What Aseh Yachid are we talking about? So there's a Yerushalmi that asks the question, Minayin la'avel min haTorah shiva. How do we know that Aveilut is biblical from the Torah for 7 days? Wow, well, that seems pretty straightforward. And the problem is that the biblical verse they quote is Vayas la'aviv evel shivat yamim. Who's that? Who made an evel for 7 days for his father? Anybody?
Yosef for Yaakov.
Yosef for Yaakov, exactly. So the fact that Yosef made an Aveilut for 7 days seems to indicate that it's biblical. Of course, this would make an assumption. What assumption does it make?
That the laws before Har Sinai are applicable today.
Excellent. The laws of before Har Sinai are applicable today. As you're all aware, there's one of the Shem Mitzvot B'nai Noach is not, right? As you open up the Sefer HaChinuch, you're not going to find Aveilut in the first, volume of Bereshit. You're just going to find, 1 or 2 commandments there, Giran Nasheh, right? You do find that sometimes the Chachamim say, in chapter 19, you have Ekev Asher Shama Avraham Bekoli Vayishmor Mishmotai Toratai Mitzvotai V'chukotai V'Toratai. So I got the pasuk off. But in chapter 18, verse 19, in Bereshit, Rashi says there, Avram Avinu did all the mitzvot, and there is a debate among the commentaries whether they did all the mitzvot. But would those mitzvot be obligatory post? That's a good question. Again, sorry, the 2 mitzvot you find in Bereshit are, of course, Kiran Nasheh and Brit Milah. You don't see Aveilut in the list. That being said, the Yerushalmi does say that. The next line is actually in my very, very, very thin YU circles. The next 5 words have 2 readings based on Rav Aaron Soloveitchik's son, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik wrote an article about these next 5 words. The next 4 words are, okay, you want to say Vayas Laviv Evel Shivat Yamim. The next 5 words are V'lemedin Dvar Kodem L'matan Torah or V'lemedin Dvar Kodem Matan Torah. So Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, again, Rav Aaron's son, says you can either read this as a question, what you're able to learn things from before Matan Torah, or it's a statement. And we paskin L'medin Dvar Torah Kodem Matan Torah in Baya, right? So depending on how you read that, you're either a question or a proof. Okay, either way, that's one source. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha B'Shem Rabbi Zira Shamalei Mehada. He has a different pasuk. The pasuk in the Miluim, right? We'll read it next Shabbos, not this coming Shabbos, the week after. Upetach o moed teshvu yomam v'layla shivat yamim ushmartem et mishmeret mishkan Hashem. Right, when doing the Miluim during the 8 days when we were dedicating the base of Mikdash, you should sit there for 7 days, and watch the take care of, protect the Mishmeret Mishkan Hashem. Kishem sheshimera kadosh baruch hu atolamo shiva, kachatem shamu alachechem shiva. So they read this as a foreshadowing of the fact that Nadav and Avihu are going to die, and I think this is before they die, but maybe it's after they die. Could be it's after they die. It says, right, just like God watched the world for 7 days, you also have to, observe something for 7 days. Uminayin sheshimera kadosh baruch hu alamo shiva. How do we know God did that? Because it took God 7 days for the Mea Mabul to be on the land. Let me just check one thing here. I want to check if this is before. The pasuk they quote is before or after the death of Nadav and Avihu. I'm sorry, I should have checked that before. Perchet pasuk lamed hey. Yeah, it's before. It's before they die. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, so we have two sources here. Again, the more famous one is the one. Again, the more direct one is the one that says they sat for 7 days. The problem is it's before Matan Torah, which might be a question, might be a statement. And the second thing is that God tells Moshe, you should watch the thing for 7 days, meaning watch your brothers. The Rif is the first one, right? The Rif is representing the Chachmei Sarad, right? He lives in Morocco and he, right, in Fez, right? And where we is Morocco today. And he's the first one who basically challenges our Gemara and has to reread into our Gemara. Now, his text, his basic source, is a Mishnah in Masechet Brachot. You remember the Mishnah in Masechet Brachot lists a number of stories about Rabbi and Rabbi Gamliel. And one of them is Rachatz Balayla Rishon Shemeta Ishto. Right, Rabbi took a shower the first night his wife died. Amru lo talmidav lo lamad Rabbeinu she'avel asur l'rchotz. Didn't you teach us that an avel is asur l'rchotz? Amar lem eini kishar kol adam istinis ani. You must remember the story. He said, I can't behave like everybody else. I'm an istinis. I'm weak. I can take a shower after the avelus kicks in. Now, if you think that the avelus can cancel a doraisa, you have another thing coming to you, right? We don't say because you're an istinis you can be machal Shabbos. We don't say because you're an istinis you can worship Avodah Zarah. So if avelus was doraisa, how could it possibly be that he took a shower afterwards? So again, so that's what the Rif jumps on, and the Rif says, "My time, anina doraita bayomhu dichtiv." Right? He says again, mixing up aninut and aveilut, even though the Mishnah uses the phrase aveilut, he used the word aninu, which is the period before the burial. But we're going to talk about that in terms of aveilut. Dichtiv acharitaki yomar v'rabbanan hu de gazru balayla. The rabbis came along and said aninut continues into the night. Uve'istinis lo gazru rabbanan. Okay, and that aninut that continued into the night was only exera to rabbanan, and for an istinis, for someone who was very frail and weak, they didn't make such exera. Such says that's how the Rif starts off. Some of my rabbis says the Rif, the kakati hadaram gamliel the kasav aninut laila de rabbanan he lo kaimelan kavate. Even though he says that aninut at night, in other words, the continuation of the aninut period. The aninut period began during the day before the burial, and it continues through the night. That's only derabanan. That position, lo kaimelan kavate. Fa'afal gav dichtiv shivat yamim leilot bichval yamim. Okay, he thinks that it might be b'doraita. Umichaz yamilta desfir leilhana rabotai. Here we get to our point already. Those rabbis who think that it's not derabanan, they believe that the zayin yemei aveilut also is doraita ninu. So he says, some people say we don't paskin like this story. In fact, not only is aninut going into the night 7 days, all of Aveilut is 7 days. Because, and he quotes the Yerushalmi, that's the Rif's first step. But he says, Velav hachin milta, but that is totally wrong. You cannot argue that Aveilut is 7 days. Velahani shiva yomi gufayu. I skipped a little, but he says the 7 days themselves. The rabbis don't rely on this that Yosef made a 7-day Aveilut for his father. They come up with another pasuk. Here's the other pasuk. It says v'hafachti chagechem la'avel. Right in the Nevi'im, it says that God is going to turn your happy days into Avel. Ma chag shiva, af Aveilut shiva. So he has a different source for being Doraisa. So again, we have two sources in the Yerushalmi, a third source in the Rif, right? That God is going to turn your Chag into Avel. If Chag is 7 days, your Avel, it should be 7 days. If you're going to tell me, and again, the Rif keeps on going with the position that it's Doraita. If you're going to tell me that it says in Moed Katan, Avel einu noagim me'avatu beregel, dichtiv v'samachta b'chagecha, Yavel mi karati ased Rabbi v'dachi ased yachid shma min adika chiyuv v'doraita. He says again. He claims. I should have said a little better. He quotes this third pasuk, but he says basically none of these should be taken seriously. Aveilut is not doraita. Maybe Aveilut the first day is doraita, but Aveilut all 7 days is not doraita. So then why does our Gemara say that there's an asay to do Aveilut? Right? Shma min adika chiyuv doraita. Right? Batter the nafikle yoma kama do yoma meet. That sounds like there's Aveilut even after the first day. Hahi lo kasha midi. Don't use our Gemara as a central source for saying there's a mitzvah of Aveilut 7 days. So again, just to summarize, we have three possible sources for. We have our Gemara that says it's an Aseh Yachid. We have either the Yosef story, the Moshe, the pasuk about Shmirah, or this Hafachti Chagechem LaAvel. All three of those seem to indicate that it's Doraita. The Rif says it's not Doraita. So what do you do? So all those psukim we can render, we can neutralize. They're all asmachta, whatever. But what do we do with our Gemara? Ahilo kasha midi dachi kamer. Aval eno noag avelutu beregel ledivrei akol va'afilu lemandamar yom rishon tofeset leilo midoraita. The avelut miikarahi ati asay deram medachi asay. He says that Gemara shouldn't be taken seriously. That Gemara was saying even if you believe that the first day is doraita, the asay derabim would cancel it, but not that that's actually the way we paskin. We don't paskin that way at all. None of it is doraita, or at least not anything past the first day of Yom HaMita and Yom HaKfura. So again, he rereads the Rif, rereads our Gemara. He cites the two parts about the Rif that are important. One, that he introduces a third possible source that is doraita. He rejects that, and he rereads our source. If you were already an Avel, meaning, right? Ati asay deram v'dachi asay diyachid. The asay diyachid is if you believe that there's such a thing as an Aseh Yachid for the Yom HaMitah and the Yom HaKfura on the same day. But I say the Rif, don't believe that at all. It's even if you believe that, but the Gemara is just trying to extend the hand and say that wouldn't work. Okay. So that's the Rif's position. How does the Rambam paskin? The Rambam paskins, again, quote the Rif, mitzvat aseh litabel al krovim. Right? There is a positive commandment. There is a Aseh Yachid. Shneimar v'achalti chatat hayom hayitav b'nei Hashem. A fourth source. Right? When after Nadav and Avihu die, and then they want to continue, then they don't eat the Kodashim because they thought they weren't supposed to eat the Kodashim. So Moshe said, God, right? It says Darosh Moshe. I think Moshe gets all angry, and then Aaron says, "Well, you think it's good for me to eat? I'm an Avel, right? My sons just died. Is that good in the eyes of God?" So what do you see? He thought that he was actually patur from eating the chatat. He was a patur from eating the kodshim. So obviously there was an avelu midoraita. Says the Rambam, ve'ein avelu min haTorah b'yom rishon bilvad shehu yom hamitai. So he says the combination, right? Not that avelut is like shiva, like those 3 psukim we had or 4 psukim that we had. Only the day of the mitah that's also the Yom HaKfura. Aval shara shiva yamim eino din Torah. Afal pi, this is rare in the Rambam. Afal pi shneimar b'Torah vayas la'avel la'aviv evel shivat yamim. Even though Yosef, like Eliezer said, Yosef did a avelut shiva. Nitnat Torah v'nitchadsha halacha. Wow. The Rambam takes that line in the Yerushalmi very seriously. What? Something that was commanded before is relevant afterwards? No. The Torah was given, everything got wiped out. All got wiped out, whatever happened. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu tiken lem shivat yemei avelut v'shivat yemei mishteh. Right? Moshe instituted shivat yemei avelut for someone who died and shivat yemei mishteh for someone who got married. Okay? The Kesef Mishnah immediately jumps down the Rambam's throat. You're bringing a 4th pasuk, not the pasuk of Yosef, which you rejected, right? You said the Torah was nitchadsha, right? Once Moshe gave the Torah. Not the pasuk of Hafachti Chagechem LaAvel. Not the pasuk of you have to shomer the Mikdash. You bring the pasuk of eating kodshim. Says the Kesef Mishnah, yesh litma alav shemikra lo tziva she'itablu. Right? The Torah never says you have to. Never tell you you're obligated to sit shiva. The Rambam writes in the Sefer Mitzvot, the Kesef Mishnah quotes a 5th source for it being biblical. Again, we have the story of Yosef, the pasuk about Hafachti Chagechem LaAvel, we have Bishomer the Mikdash, we have Achalti Chatat Kol HaYamim. The Kesef Mishnah says the Rambam quotes another pasuk. The Rambam makes a big cholent of everything, and he says the source of Avel is that a Kohen has to go into a cemetery for his krovim. A Kohen has to go into a cemetery for his krovim. The Rambam says Zeu batzmo din mitzvot ivul. Going to the cemetery is part of the nature of Aveilut. Very interesting. Klomar, not just the Kohen. Klomar kol ish Yisrael chayav litabel al krovav. Klomar ashisha. One sec. What is this? Klomar shisha metei mitzvah. Right, the 6 relatives that you have to go through. Ulechazek chiyuva bier oto bekohen shu musar ala tumah. Shitameh al kol panim keshar Yisrael. right? The Rambam has this other source in the Sefer HaMitzvot, which is not the source he quotes in the Mishnah Torah, where he says the source is that the fact that the Kohen has to go be metame, it's not up to him. He can't just decide, oh, I'm going to be frummer than thou. By the way, I get this all the time nowadays. There's a whole thing in Israel, just as an aside, an Etim story, right? We all know that the Kohen goes to the cemetery. In some of the cemeteries in Yerushalayim, they won't let the Kohen go to the cemetery because they say, yes, the Kohen is allowed to go to the cemetery, to go to the grave, but he's not allowed to walk back. So they don't let Kohanim go to the cemeteries in some of these places. That's what I call frummer than thou, because that's exactly what the Rambam says. You missed the whole point. It's not up to the Kohen to say, I don't want to go and be metame. No, you must. And then says the Rambam, not only you must, but that's just an example of the whole Aveilut theme. The whole Aveilut theme is everybody must sit Aveilut. Right? Shisham, you have to. Right? The chazek. This is in the Mishnah in the Sefer Mitzvah. The chazek chiyuzeh bi'arto b'kohen. Why did the Torah choose Aveilut in the Kohen? For to demonstrate how serious it was. So we have 5 biblical sources. Again, the with the Rif saying it's not true. 5 biblical sources for Aveilut, at least on the first day or all 7 days. That's the Kesef Mishnah. Rabbi Soloveitchik, here's the first piece of Lamdas that's interesting. Up till now, we've been talking about the Minhagei Aveilut or maybe eating Kodshin. There is a Gemara in Moed Katan a little later that says Avel. Sorry, that Aleph got a little smaller. That's just a mistake. Sorry. Avel eino mishaleach korbanotav. An Avel doesn't send his korbanot. Meaning, if I'm a shaliach of an Avel, I can't even, let's say I want to go bring a korban. I can't do it for an Avel. An Avel is not allowed to send his korbanot. The Tanya Rishon Omer shlamim bizmanshu shalem v'lo bizmanshu onein. Okay, the word onein here shouldn't be taken as aninut. It means an Avel. The whole week, you shouldn't send your korbanot. A shliach is not allowed to send the korbanot. So Rabbi Soloveitchik looked at this Gemara and he said, wait a second, there's something odd about this Gemara that doesn't fit into the pattern we've been talking about. Until now, we've been talking about minhagei Aveilut, right? And we said, some people think the minhagei Aveilut all 7 days are d'oraita. And some people think just the first day, minhagei. So why, right? All of a sudden, we have a whole other din of not sending your korban. So let's say you believe, how do you deal with this source if you believe that Avel just the first day is d'oraita? How can they stop you from sending a korban? They say you don't send the korban. So I don't know if any of you want to make an attempt to answer this, but Rabbi Soloveitchik made the following distinction. He said we have to think about when we talk about an Avel being chayv and Aveilut 7 days, like those 3 sources, or being chayv and Aveilut 1 day, like some of those other sources. We have to think about 2 dimensions of Aveilut. One dimension is the status of an Avel, and the other dimension is the practices of an Avel, right? The Shem Avel or the Minhagei Aveilut. Status versus practice. Rabbi Soloveitchik said, and this is possible by the Rambam as well, the Avel eno mishalech korbanotav. Rabbi Soloveitchik said we can make it for the following distinction. When we talk about this Gemara, look closely at this Gemara. The Gemara says, Bizmanshu Shalem. This talks about his status, not his practice. The status has a manifestation in practice, which is that he cannot send his korbanot. But you see this din of Bizmanshu Shalem, that seems to relate to his personal status. He has a Shem Avel. Rabbi Soloveitchik argued that the shame, even if you believe that Aveilut in the Rambam is only, like the Rambam says, is only d'oraita yom echad, that only relates to the minhagei Aveilut. But the shame Avel applies for all 7 days. Or to put it in different terms, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, we don't need to contrast the 7 days of Yosef's thing, right? No, it says Yosef made Aveilut 7 days. If we go back to the Yerushalmi, right? What did the Yerushalmi say? Right, you remember, Minayin la'avel min Torah, because it's Vayas la'aviv Avel shivat yamim. That relates to the practice. That practice, that's rejected by the Rishonim, or at least the Sephardi Rishonim and the Ashkenazi Rishonim. But that doesn't relate to the status. The status of an Avel, which will be for 7 days, and because of that, right? Because of that, an Avel, even if we believe that the Avel doesn't have to do the observances that midoraita 7 days, he will still have the status of an Avel for 7 days, and he can't send his korbanot. Okay, so I think that's a very, very important distinction for me, and it has all sorts of nafkaminas. Okay, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Okay, but now let's talk about nafkaminas. Before we get to the Ashkenazi Rishonim and the Shulchan Aruch, which is where I want to end. Let's talk about some of the nafkaminas, whether Aveilut is Doraisa or Dorabanan. Again, one of the things I'm not doing today is talk about if you have the different, this is something that's worth thinking about, which is if you have different sources, what would it imply? So yet so far we've shown 5 sources that it's Doraita. Those split into 2 categories. Some people say it's Doraita for 7 days. Some people say it's Doraita just for 1 day. We saw there might be a difference between a Shem Avel and Minhagei Aveilut. That's the Rav's theory based on the fact that an Avel can't send a Shlamim. What I'm not discussing is the differences between the different sources and how that might manifest itself. But let's say you hold that it's only us for 1 day, or let's say you hold it's us for 7 days. What possible nafkaminas could there be? So the Ashkenazi Rishonim, particularly the Or Zarua, the end of the Tosafos period, quotes the Rif. First he quotes the Rif, Halach Lamaisa, and then he quotes a very, 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 very famous nafkamina, which we'll see also in the Bahag, and it is practical, and you'll see in the Shulchan Aruch as well. If you bury someone on the Chag, lo chayla le Aveilut. Right, Aveilut doesn't start. Like I said, the Rav died on the 3rd day the 2nd day of Pesach. The burial was on the 3rd day of Pesach on Chol HaMoed, and then the Shiva started at the end. Nakid Zayin Yemei Aveilut. This you might remember from this. We count 7 Yemei Aveilut. Miyom Tov Acharon. What does that mean? It means that it's a bargain. You're supposed to sit 7 days. I know we count the last day, so 6 and a bit. Victor Yom Kikulo. But we count Yom Tov Sheni, the last day of Pesach, or the last day of Sukkot, or the 2nd day of Shavuos, as 1 day. Right? You remember this? Has anybody ever? I assume most of you have encountered this at some point. Yom Tov Sheni is counted as the 1st day, even though it's a hybrid. Afagav the lo nag bo Aveilut olalo. Says the Rif, if someone dies on the Chol HaMoed, based on our Gemara, right? If someone dies on Chol HaMoed, so the Shiva only, right? It's like a good question to ask your kids, right? When is 7-6? And the answer, when is 7-6? If someone dies on Chol HaMoed, because the 2nd day of Chol HaMoed, it's a hybrid in the sense that we don't do Minhagei Aveilut on Yom Tov Sheni, meaning Yom Tov Sheni of the last day, right? The 8th day of Pesach, or the 8th day or the 9th day of Sukkot, or the 2nd day of Shavuos, right? You with me? We don't do Minhagei Aveilut, but it counts as a day. There are Dinei Aveilut without Minhagei Aveilut. Right? You follow? So says the Rif. This is actually just an interesting historical source. I don't know if who's on the call, but is a very, very fascinating historical source. I like this. This I'm just throwing in as like a aside. B'shem Rav Yehuda Gon, the Yom Tov Achron Ola Min and Shiva v'Gon Acher Yishiv Mash Nimtza Bahag Ba'alachot Evel Yom Chet El Pesach Ola Min and Shiva. Right, the last day of Pesach counts for Shiva. Lav Samcho, you can't trust that thing. V'Leta Klal, it's not true. If you don't sit Aveilut, if you don't sit Shiva, it doesn't count. Right? V'Leta Klal, the Lo Ashkan the Palag Rabbanan Mektushat Yom Tov Rishon Lektushat Yom Tov Sheni Ela Lekvurat Hamet. The only thing they said about Yom Tov Rishon, Yom Tov Sheni is that on Yom Tov Sheni you can bury somebody. Right? The Hasidim do this. They bury on Yom Tov Sheni. They only said that you can do this, that you can cut down, hadassim to make it smell better. The same, there is no Aveilut. After the entire regel, meaning you don't start counting Yom Tov Sheni, after the 8th day of Pesach, on the 9th day, that's the 1st day of Aveilut. Shita. Why do they say you count Shiva? Say you count 6. That's why when 7 is 6. Of Yom Bet Shalatzeret, only Minyan Shiva, Linka Pater Regla Shita. Betul lo tzarech elavadai. Betul lo tzarech elavadai einan olin kishar yemei regel. Then he says, this is the interesting historical part. Afal pishet shuva zon ichtava b'shem Rabbi Yehuda Gaon. Even though there was a Gaon who wrote this, ein li smoch alav. Why not? Temachu le'mea uchle be'uchla kedamrinan. Right? Because a lot of bad things crept into Rabbi Yehuda Gaon's letters. This is very funny. There was a response that was written. Havayodin shalachot elu shalmar Rabbi Yehuda Gaon let chazina bebavel biyomai to Rabbi Yehuda. all the letters of Rabbi Yehuda Gaon we did not see in Bavel during his lifetime. Ela Batrei Shir Mea Shanim. That only appeared 100 years later. Yehuda Gaon's letters. Shabon Aitin LeBavel V'Lo Yadin Hecha. Amar Yehuda Gaon Meikara Rav Yehuda, right? And we don't even know when Rav Yehuda Gaon said it. No, it's they're claiming that Rav Yehuda Gaon's tshuvas are a big forgery, right? We're talking about a forgery from 1,000 years ago. And they say not only was it a forgery that the book never appeared in his lifetime and only showed up 100 years later when someone was trying to forge it in his name, but they say Mikar Rav Yehuda Gaon Ma'orei Naima, he was blind. He didn't even know how to write because he was totally blind. We can't trust Rav Yehuda Gaon's thing that we don't count the first day. Okay, that's an interesting halacha. So again, we have a machloket here, whether you count Yom Tov Sheni as a Yom of Aveilut, even though there aren't Dinei Aveilut, right? No one thinks they're Dinei Aveilut yet so far. But then there's a third, right? So one person says start counting from the 9th day. One person says start counting from the 8th day, but don't do Minhagi Aveilut. And then the Or Zarua quotes Rabbeinu Chanan. If someone died on the last day of Pesach, or on the second day of Shavuot, we have a third opinion. If someone died on the last day of Pesach, on Yom Tov Sheni, basically of the last days, 8th day of Pesach, 9th day of or Simchas Torah, or the second day of Shavuos, then and you do the burial on that day. You do the burials on, again, we don't do the burials on Yom Tov Sheni, but in the time of the Gemara they did, and the Hasidim still do, and embroiders they still do. So he says, not only do you do the burial, but since that day is both Yom HaMita and Yom HaKfura, then you would actually sit Shiva on Yom Tov Sheni. That's an amazing shita. So what's the debate here? Whether you wait till the 9th day, or you start counting on this 8th day, but you don't do Minhagi Avelos till the 9th day, or if it's Yom HaMita and Yom HaKfura is the last day of Pesach, then you would actually start sitting Shiva as well. This should be the nafkamina between whether Aveilut Shiva is Doraita, or Aveilut Yom Echad is Doraita, or it's all Durabanan. If it's all Durabanan, if all the Aveilut is Durabanan, there's no way you would do anything on Yom Tov Sheni, right? If it's Doraita, then it should beat out Yom Tov Sheni, right? Whether you hold 7 days as Doraita, or you, right? And then, in fact, you would start counting it, right? You would start counting the day, even without doing the Minhagei Shiva. And if you hold that it's Doraita, the super Doraita, that Yom HaMita and Yom HaKfur is the same, then it's Doraita, then not only theoretically, you might actually come to the conclusion, this amazing conclusion, like the Rabbeinu Chananel says, that not only would you, if the person died on Simchas Torah, and you buried them on Simchas Torah, then in fact you'd sit Shiva on Simchas Torah. You wouldn't just wait. So this is the nafkamina. Do you sit Shiva on Yom Tov Sheni? Do you count the Yom Tov Sheni as a day, or do you not count it at all? If it's totally D'Rabbanan, you won't count it at all. If it's a pseudo Doraita or maybe a real Doraita, then you'd count it even if it's Yom HaMita and Yom HaPtira. And again, if you hold it 7 days as Doraita, or you hold a variation that even if it's Yom HaMita without Yom HaKvura without Yom HaMita, if let's say someone died on the 7th day of Pesach and you buried them on the 8th day, even if it's not the same day, then theoretically you'd also start counting on that day. So that's a very, very important nafkamina. We'll see in the Shulchan Aruch in a minute. Someone had a question?
Question about putting on tefillin on the day on the first day?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Right. No, it could be that putting on tefillin, not on Chol HaMoed, not on the 8th day, but putting on tefillin on the day of the Ptira and the day of the right. I didn't bring that nafkamina, just I wanted to move forward. But the issue of putting on tefillin for the Avel, which is is a big debate, right? We all put on. We know the Avel is right from we learned from Yechezkel that the Avel doesn't put on tefillin on the day of the Ptira. That's also the day of the Kfura. What about putting on tefillin if it's a different day, right? In America or here, also sometimes we wait a day for the burial. Someone died in the afternoon, so we do the burial the next day. So then, do we tell them after mincha, hey, go put on tefillin? By the way, halacha l'maaseh, even though you'll see what the Shulchan Aruch says in a minute, we generally put on tefillin even if it's the same day. But in principle, I always tell people if it's the same day, they shouldn't put on tefillin at mincha. When they get home from the cemetery. But if it's not the same day, then for sure, even though they're Kol Zman, they were not onen, they don't put on tefillin, but the moment the burial happens at Minchor, right, as soon as they get home, they should put on tefillin right away. I always tell people to do that. Okay? So that's one nafkamina. As I said, if you believe, before we get to now we're going to get to the Tosef.
So as a practical matter, do people actually, I know you have a halakhic answer, but as a practical matter, do people actually do it or?
Yes. People go home and you get home from the funeral, assuming there's enough time. Generally, in other words, if the death happened on like Tuesday and the funeral happened on Wednesday morning, so they'll have enough time morning to get home. Usually they'll do the funeral in the morning at 11, right? So then by the time, even if they go wherever to Long Island or they go to wherever it is that they're going to do the burial and they come home at 3, they still have enough time to put on tefillin. Then people actually do put on tefillin. Yes. Remember, the whole issue of tefillin, I'll just make a general statement, which you should just be aware, right? It never says in the Torah you have to put on tefillin every day, right? And the Rashba, it's very clear.
I know.
Right? I think you should put on tefillin every day. I think it's an important thing to do, but it never says it. The Briskers were very famous, right? They're a Soloveitchik family. We're very famous for saying the mido right. Even though we say that night is not zman tefillin, they felt like, and certainly Shabbos is not zman tefillin, but they felt the chiyuv of tefillin begins on Sunday morning and it ends on Friday afternoon, right? So they actually did this because this is so typical of Soloveitchik, right? They said if someone was sick or something and missed a day of tefillin, they should just wear tefillin longer the next day because they said it's all one big kiyum mitzvah for the whole week, right? So they just said, just wear it longer, more than you would. And remember, Rav Kook used to wear tefillin all day, right? No, that's what, again, the minhag is not to wear tefillin. The minhag, again, according to Shana, is to wear tefillin every day. You still have to wear tefillin for Shema in principle because you don't want to be me'idei do check here. So you have to wear tefillin for Shema. But again, if you, I try not to tell people this because, some people that's the mitzvah they hold on to. Like, even if I don't daven every day, I'm going to put on tefillin every day, right? I see it a lot with in this country, right? I've told this story before. I'll just tell it very quickly, but I have these people who, they come to convert and they want to convert, spouse or something like that, and they say, "Ani lo dati," right? Oh, tefillin, baruch shani meniach tefillin, every day. Of course, like who wouldn't put on tefillin every day? But I'm not dati, right? Yeah, Shema, I say Shema every day, right? So I say, you're dati.
Listen, someone who says Shema and puts on tefillin every day is pretty observant.
Right, no, but they say it like they say, I'm not dati, but I put on tefillin every day for sure. I remember I was once at some member of Knesset whose kids I converted, and I remember being at his house, and you wouldn't think this guy's at all religious, but on the way out of his house he says, I just wanted to let you know, and he shows me on the way out, he says, every day before I go to the Knesset, and he opens his drawer right by his by his door, and he has his tefillin there. He every day. He says, haven't missed a day. So, what can I tell you? People have different things to latch onto. So again, Marty, in terms of your discussion, the question of putting on tefillin would also be another nafkamina about whether, how, again, if Aveilut is d'oraita, then in principle, you should not put on tefillin the day, at least if it's the day of, the day of the death. And that's in fact the way we pass if it's one day. If on the other hand, it's all the Rabbanon, so there'd be no reason to, stop at a certain point from putting on tefillin. Okay, as I mentioned to you, I'll just throw this out quickly. For those who hold that Aveilut Shiva is not d'oraita, which is the standard position, again, unlike the Yerushalmi and unlike that position we started off in the Rif and all the sources we saw. So again, one way to read our Gemara is, well, if you believe it's d'oraita, so then there's an asay d'oraita. The Rosh quotes a Ravid who says that he says as follows. He has a different reading of our Gemara. I'm just going to take this line out because it's not helpful. Our Gemara seems to indicate, right? It says the only reason that Aveilut stops, the holiday stops Aveilut if you started sitting Aveilut is because the Asay de Rabim, right? The commandment of the community comes along and cancels the commandment to the individual. And then we threw up our hands and said, what commandment to the individual? That's what we're the Yerushalmi, etc. Right? Either that there's a commandment to the individual on all 7 days, or if it's the first day, then right? And then the Rif said, oh, it's talking about even if you believe that it's all 7 days, right? So Tiretz Rav Alfasi says the Rif answered Dachi Kamar. No one believes that there's Aveilut. Even if you believe, if someone died on Erev Chag, and you believe that it would go into the Chag, that would still cancel it. That's the way the Rif read it, right? Not I read it before, sorry, a little differently. I read it as even if you believe that Aveilut is Shiva, He says, even if you believe Aveilut is Doraita one day, and it happened on Erev Chag, the Asay de Rabim would cancel the Asay de Yachid. Okay, that's the way the Rif says. He says, Ve'eno nir l'ra'avad. The Ravid, right, from Provence, didn't like that reading of the Rif. Lefaresh stama dashas deloke ilchata. That the Gemara was saying, even if you believe that is that the Aveilut is Doraita one day and the person died on Erev Chag, the Chag would cancel it. He says it doesn't make sense. The Gemara would raise it even if according to that position. It's just not usual. Upeirishu, I'm not going to go into this too much, but Upeirishu, the Ravid has a totally different reading of our Gemara. Tadakamara hachadiga say Doraita ba'Aveilut the miikara. What's the Isur Doraita that exists in our Gemara that Yontif has to cancel? Ba'Aveilut the Shloshim Yom. Oh, we weren't talking about Aveilut Shiva. We were talking about Shloshim. That's Doraita. What Aveilut the Shloshim is Doraita. The Hainu Gihutz V'Tisporet. Oh, there is a Doraita. There's no Aveilut 7 days for the normal things, to sit on the floor, to learn Torah. None of that is Doraita. None of that is Doraita. What is Doraita? Ironing your clothes and taking a haircut. Because the Gemara in Daf Yutet learns it out from Nazir. Para mi Nazir. Right? We know that Aaron, after his sons died, was told, you should cut your hair and don't rip your clothes. Oh, those are Doraita for 30 days. That's where the Gemara said, Aveilut will come in and cancel those. But the Gemara never thought that anything else other than those two things were Doraita. So here we get a very, very, this is what I call disconcerting, or, it creates a huge imbalance. That it turns out that washing your clothes and shaving, those are Doraita for 30 days. And that's what the Gemara says, but Yontif will cancel it. Okay, not all the Rishonim like this theory. They find the right.
They don't learn that from the 30 days that was an Aveilut for Aaron?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But they don't learn it from that. They learn it from the Nazir.
Since it's learned from since Aveilut, since the not tearing your clothes, or not changing your clothes, basically, or not ironing your clothes, and not cutting your hair, are learned from the Nazir, and the Nazir is 30 days. So these also were 30 days, and that's biblical. Like I said, that's very, very unsettling to imagine that those two things, right? I got a Shiloh this week. Someone was sitting Shiva, not your relative, Elisur, someone else was sitting Shiva, and a family member didn't know that the person had died. It's very elderly. And they were going to that family member for Shabbos. So they wanted to know if they could shave after the Shiva, but during the Shloshim, they wanted to know if they could shave. So as to protect, because they didn't want the elderly family member to know they had been sitting Shiva. That's a Shiloh I get. According to this Ravid, you couldn't tell them to shave, or at least it would be, it's a Safek Pikuach Nefesh. You have to try harder than if it's only Durabanan. Understand what I'm saying? You have to try much harder. So that's the Ravid's reading of our Gemara. So that's a second neutralization of our Gemara. So again, we have the simple reading of our Gemara that it's Doraita, and then we have one reading of our Gemara that's, if you believe that the death happened on Erev Yontif and that the Aveilut went to the night, then even according to that number, or no, we were talking about a different type of Aveilut Doraita, the 30 days of Doraita. Finally, we get to the Ashkenazim, okay? What you've all been waiting for. Aval Reperish, this is quoted in the Rush, but it's in Rabbeinu Tam also, it's all over the place. Reperish deleka Aveilut klal midoraita. There is no such thing. Not the 30 days of the of the ironing or the haircuts, not the 7 days of the Yerushalmi, not the 1 day if it's not the same day as death, not the 1 day even if it's the same day of death. There is no Aveilut. Even though the preparation for burial is Minat Torah, Anina L'chud, very, very important phrase. Anina L'chud, Va'aveilut L'chud. Right? Ha'asur b'zeh, mutar b'zeh, v'asur b'zeh, mutar b'zeh. Aninut is one thing, Aveilut is another thing. Never the twain shall meet. This is the antithesis of the Rambam, who puts them all in a big cholent. He says, we learn all of Aveilut in the Sefer HaMitzvot, right? The contrast source is the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvot, where he says, when the Torah told a Kohen to go into the cemetery, it was talking about Aveilut, Aninut, all of that. It's all one big cholent. Ashkenazim, much more separate categories. There's Aninut, there's Aveilut, they never mix. V'hada onin asur yom rishon minat Torah, the prohibitions of the onin, hainu b'achilat kachim. That's what Aaron was told. You shouldn't eat kachim today. You should eat kachim today. Right? Aaron said, what? You think God wants me to eat kachim on the day my sons died? Moshe tells him, yes, that's what God wants. No one else, but you. Even though your sons haven't been buried yet, you have to go eat kudshim. Okay? And then there was all sorts of other things the Chachamim added on. Aval ba'aveilut, this is the key line, lo matzinu b'shum makom shenoheg b'yom rishon min haTorah. Okay? That's it. Nekuda. You couldn't get a more powerful statement than that. Okay? Their proof is a very, very fascinating proof. It's a Gemara that you're all familiar with, even though, again, it's a little disconcerting. Right, what's the proof? The Gemara in Ketubot. What's the Gemara in Ketubot? Meit aviv shel chatan o ima shel kala. Right? You have a couple on their way to the wedding. I've been in a few weddings like this where they did the wedding. One of my former chavruta, his father was dying literally on the day of the wedding. And I remember we went in the morning, the wedding was in the evening, we went in the morning and did the chuppah in the hospital room. So the father could be there. Now, theoretically, what if the father, let's say they didn't do that, and the father davened right as they were on their way to the chuppah. So what do? We have a very, very halacha that people find very, very uncomfortable. Machnisin et hamet lacheder. We don't tell the bride and groom. We just don't tell them. We bring the dead body, we put them into a room. V'tachatan v'takala lechupa. Uboel bilat mitzvah. Right? They go ahead with their wedding. Uporesh, the koveret meito. Then you do the kfura on the day after the wedding. And then you do sheva brachot, noheg shiva yimei mishteh. V'achar kach noheg shiva yimei aveilut. That's a very, very disconcerting halacha. Right? Says the Ri, Im Ita, he says, this is my proof. This is the ultimate proof that Aveilut couldn't possibly be Doraita. V'im Ita da Aveilut Yom Rishon min haTorah. If Aveilut the first day was Midoraita, Heach Titcha Mitzvah min haTorah Mnei Mishnah Dechupa Derabanan. How can we possibly put the dead body in a different room and go ahead with the Mishnah and forget about the? And once you bury him, that should kick it. The Aveilut should trump the Aveilut should trump the Sheva brachos. So he says the fact that we let you do Sheva brachos and then Sheva Yimei Aveilut elavadai kol shivat Yimei Aveilut enu elami derabanan. L'chein yitchin b'pnei Yimei HaMishteh. Okay, that is the proof of the Ri. Says the Rush, not such a compelling proof. Again, with more time, I would ask you to respond to this. The lav rayahu. To lo kamar Rav Avasi Aveilut Yom Rishon Midoraita el de nikvar b'yom hamita. He says the Rif only said that it's Doraita if the burial and the death happened the same day, right? So what? How do you explain the Gemara in Ketubot? V'ahid Ketubot hachi kamar machnisin et hamed lacheder, right? He says take the Gemara very seriously. You do the wedding, you send the couple off for their wedding night, right? Oh, you send the couple off for the wedding night, and then you do the burial the next day. Says the Rush, you solved my problem now. Why? Because the wedding happened before sunset. The burial happened the next day. So now it's not the same day, the burial and the death. Therefore, it's not Doraita. And that's why the Aveilut gets suspended till 7 days. You understand? So you know that's his proof. Where it's dafka because you pushed off the burial until the next day, then it's not the same day. If in fact the wedding happened at night, or the death happened like, let's say the chuppah was for 8 o'clock in the evening, and the death happened like on the way to the chuppah, like literally after Shkia, then in fact you would have a problem. And in fact, the Rush says you might actually you wouldn't do this game of pushing off the Aveilut for 7 days, because maybe it's Doraita. Okay. One sec. Okay, we're gonna just skip down to the Shulchan Aruch now. So how does the there's a number of other proofs, but there is one source here that I wanted to show you. He had the Ramah, Reish Mem Hey, Meir Levi Abulafia from Toledo, who was a 13th century rabbi, he had a different explanation of this Gemara in Ketubot. He says, this is very, very interesting. Words again, what was the Gemara in Ketubot says, right? It seems to be a proof that Aveilut is all D'Rabbanan, because how could you push off the Aveilut in reference to the Sheva Bracha? The Rush said that's not such a compelling proof. Answer number one, why not? Because they did, the people who hold the right to hold that it has to be the death and the burial on the same day. And the fact that you pushed off the burial means the death and the burial are not on the same day, and therefore it's not the Oraita. The Rav Meir Levi Abulafi has a different answer. This is very clever, very interesting, and very repercussive. Rav Meir Levi katav the Yom Echad Shel Simchat Chatan Havi Doraita. He says Sheva Brachas can actually. He says you assume the whole time that Sheva Brachas is not Doraita. And therefore you said we have a clash. How can you choose Sheva Brachot over Aveilut? And that seems to prove that Aveilut is the Rabbanan. Instead of pushing down the Aveilut like the Rush did, he's going to push up the Sheva Brachos. He's going to say Sheva Brachos, at least the first day is Doraita. And therefore there's no clash. We have two Doraitas. Very fascinating. Excuse me. The Yom Echad Shel Simchat Chatan Havi Doraita Dichtiv Yom Chatunato V'Yom Simchat Libo. Right? That's when Shlomo HaMelech, in the Midrash, that's when he built the temple. But on the day of his wedding, so you see, Alma de Simchat Yom B'Yom Rishon Yesh Lo Smach Min HaTorah. So again, we have two methods about how to explain this Gemara in Ketubot that says you push off the funeral. Either you push off the funeral because it's the Rabbanan, and maybe the first day is Doraita. Yeah, but we separated the Kvura and the Aveilut. Or maybe instead of saying that's the Rabbanan, we can say there is a clash, but it's a clash of two Doraitas, and therefore the one that has precedence is the one you've already started. In other words, when the couple gets married, the first day of Sheva Brachos is Doraita, and since the first day of Sheva Brachos is Doraita, that's why we push off the Aveilut, which also might be Doraita. Just halacha l'maisa very quickly. And I can't believe I'm skipping all these great sources, but okay. The Shulchan Aruch puts this all together in two places, in Yoreh De'ah and Orach Chaim, but the part that's important to us is Yoreh De'ah. When you have Yom Tov Sheni, right, again, because he's writing already from Tzvat. Misha made lo made be Yom Tov Sheni. If someone dies, Shu Yom Tov Acharon Shel Pesach, O Shel Chag, you ready for your shock? O be Yom Tov Shel Atzeret. If someone dies, Yom Tov Sheni Shel Atzeret, if someone dies on the second day of Shavuos, the Kavru Bo Bayom, and they did the Kvura, which again the Hasidim do. No Heg Bo Avelus. You could have someone sitting Shiva on Simchas Torah. That's the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins, because we paskin that it's Doraita. Hoil v'Yom Tov Sheni midivreim v'Aveilut Yom Rishon Shu Yom Amita v'Kvura Shel Torah Yidche Aseh Shel Divreim Mipnei Aseh Shel Torah. Wow, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that in fact, if the burial happens, if the death and the burial happens on the last day of Sukkot, the last day of Shavuos, the last day on Yom Tov Sheni, in fact, you would sit Shiva on Yom Tov Sheni. Avali made be Yom Tov Sheni Shel Rosh Hashanah. The Kavru Bo Bayom. This is just an aside. There's one of the nafkaminas about Yom Arichta. The Rosh Hashanah is one long day. That's only, this is the Rambam for the 7 Avelim that the Kohen can be mitami for. But the other ones they added, like your half sister and stuff like that. You wouldn't do that. Okay, that's an aside. Words on Simchas Torah you won't do kriya because that's a doraita, right? That's a malacha. Okay, Adkan, amazing. Shulchan Aruch, incredible. You would actually sit shiva because Aveilut is doraita. So again, we have a position. We have 5 sources that it's doraita. Some of those sources are only that it's the first day, and that's only if it's Yom Kippur or Yom Amita. The Tosafos say it's Derabanan. The Shulchan Aruch paskins like the Chachmei Sfarad that it's Doraita, and therefore he comes up with this nafkamina. Here he doesn't quote the issue Marty about the tefillin, but he does come up with this nafkamina that in fact you could end up sitting shiva on Chol HaMoed, on Yom Tov Sheni. But the Shulchan Aruch then finishes up. V'ha'olam noagim shelo litabel b'Yom Tov Sheni shel galiot al shum meit afilu Yom Mita v'Yom HaKfura. Notwithstanding the halacha that I just quoted, that all the Chachmei Sfarad adopted, people don't do it. This is an amazing source, right? Outstanding, right? Fantastic source. Even though the halacha is 100% clear that the Yom HaMita, Yom HaKfur, you have to do it, it would trump that no one does it. And then says the Ramah, the Sovrim Kedat Omrim Shein Shum Aveilut Doraita, because that's the Tosafos. They don't believe that any Aveilut is Doraita. And he quotes Rabbi Nutam, the Reed, the Rush, all the Chachmei Ashkenaz. So again, it's hard to believe. I don't believe that the Chachmei Sfarad were really adopting the position of the Tosafos. I just think that's what happened over time. Basically, people just couldn't bring themselves to sit shiva on Chol HaMoed, and what ended up happening is we count the day of Chol HaMoed as a yom. Right? It was this hybrid that we do today that we count it as a yom, but we don't sit shiva. That's a remarkable thing. And also, I got to be honest. I think from a historical perspective, it didn't happen that much that someone would also die on the day on Yom Tov Sheni and also get buried on Yom Tov Sheni. More likely, most of the people who most of the Aveilut that happened after Chol HaMoed happened because someone died during Chol HaMoed or on the first day of Yom Tov, and because of that, it just fell out of practice to do this. So again, just to summarize, we have this theory of the Rav that there is a 7-day period that you have the Shem Aveilut without the Minhagei Aveilut. Then we have 3 positions: either all 7 days are Doraita, the Yerushalmi, cited in the Rif as well with some other sources. Or you have that one day is Doraita, which in most Rishonim appears as the day of Kfura, which is also the Yom HaMita. And then you have its Durabanan. The nafkamina, as we mentioned, the tefillin issue, but the main nafkamina is how you would treat with Yom Tov Sheni, right? Or it's, so again, the Rav tried to moderate the whole discussion by saying that there's a distinction between the Shem Avel and the Minhage Aveilut. But in the normative halacha, that distinction doesn't play itself out. Instead, what plays itself out is how Doraita do we take it? And again, in the normative halacha, if we take it very Doraita, the Yom HaMita Yom HaKfura, you would end up sitting Shiva, not just counting the Yom Tov Sheni as a day of Aveilut, as the first day, even though you don't do anything, but you'd actually sit Shiva on Cholamo. We saw that. We saw one of three opinions in the Rash. That is quoted halacha l'maaseh by the Shulchan Aruch, but he says olam no ginken. The Ramah tries to say yeah, because you're doing like the Tosafist, like the Ashkenazi poskim. But I don't think that's the simple reading of the Rif. Simple reading of the Rif is I want people to do it, but they're not doing it. There's nothing I can do about it, and that's just what it is. Okay, so we'll stop here, and Emir Hashem, next time we'll pick up with some of the Minhagi Aveilut that we began to discuss this time. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful week, everybody.
Also, thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Bye.
Oh, so thank you.
Thank you.